Elias Carter stood at the periphery, unnoticed, his worn olive-green jacket blending into the crowd's muted edges. His hands, gnarled but steady, clutched a folded piece of paper, its edges yellowed and soft from years of handling. The paper was a letter, dated July 12th, 1969. Its ink faded but legible. He didn't need to read it. He knew every word. At 78, Elias carried himself with a quiet dignity, his shoulders slightly stooped, but his spine still hinting at the Marine he'd once been. A faint tattoo of an eagle, globe, and anchor peeked from under his sleeve, the ink blurred by time. His dog tags, tucked beneath his shirt, pressed cool against his chest, a private reminder of who he'd been. He'd come to the ceremony uninvited, drawn by a pull that he couldn't name. He hadn't been to Fort Bragg in decades, not since he'd left the Corps in '72. But this year, something had stirred. An article in the local paper about the event. A memory of a promise made long ago. He'd driven 3 hours from his small apartment in Fayetteville, the radio off, the hum of his old pickup filling the silence. Now, standing at the gate, he felt out of place, a ghost among the living. The young soldier at the entrance, barely out of his teens, glanced at Elias's ID, a worn VA card with a photo that didn't quite match the man before him. "Sir, this event's by invitation only," the soldier said, his voice polite but firm. "I don't see your name on the list." Elias nodded, his expression unreadable. "I understand, son. Just thought I'd try." His voice was low, gravelly, with a faint Carolina drawl. He stepped back, the letter crinkling in his hand. The soldier's eyes flicked to it, then away, already scanning the next person in line. Elias turned, his boots scuffing the gravel, and moved toward a nearby bench, its paint chipped but sturdy. He sat, the cold wood seeping through his jacket, and watched the crowd file in. The ceremony began with the sharp notes of a bugle calling attention. A colonel took the stage, his voice booming through the speakers, recounting the sacrifices of those who'd served. Elias listened, his eyes tracing the flags: Old Glory, the North Carolina state flag, the Marine Corps banner. Each word from the stage felt like a stone dropped into a still pond, rippling through memories he'd buried deep. Vietnam, the heat, the mud, the screams, the faces of men he'd pulled from hell, their blood on his hands, their thanks in their eyes. He'd been a corpsman, a doc, though he'd never liked the term. It made him sound like a hero, and he wasn't. He'd just done his job. The crowd applauded as a group of young Marines, fresh from Paris Island, marched in formation. Their boots hit the ground in unison, a sound that echoed in Elias's chest. He'd walked that same field once, his own boots knew, his heart pounding with purpose. Now, he was just an old man, invisible to the family's snapping photos, the officers shaking hands, the kids waving tiny flags. He didn't mind, not really, he'd never been one for attention. But the soldier's words at the gate stung more than he'd expected. Not on the list. As if his years, his scars, his losses could be reduced to a clerical oversight. He shifted on the bench, the letter in his hand catching the light. It was from a Marine named Tommy, a kid from Ohio who'd taken a bullet in Hugh. Elias had dragged him to cover, patched him up under fire, kept him alive until the medevac came. Tommy's letter, written months later from a hospital bed, was a thank you, simple and raw. "You gave me a second chance, Doc. I owe you my life." Elias had saved others too. 132 by his last count, though he didn't keep a tally for pride. It was just a number, a weight he carried. Most of those men were gone now, lost to time or war, or the slow grind of life after. The letter was all he had left of Tommy. A group of civilians passed by, their chatter loud, oblivious to the old man on the bench. One of them, a woman in a red coat, glanced at him, then away, her eyes sliding past like he was part of the scenery. Elias didn't flinch. He was used to being unseen. But then a child, maybe 6, broke from the group, clutching a small flag. She stopped in front of him, her ponytail bouncing. "Are you a soldier?" she asked, her voice clear and curious. Elias hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Was, once, a Marine." Her eyes widened. "Did you fight bad guys?" He chuckled, the sound rough but warm. Something like that. Mostly helped people who got hurt. She tilted her head, studying his jacket, the faded tattoo. You look old. Feel old, too, he said, his smile deepening. What's your name? Lila, she said, waving her flag. My dad's in the army. He's over there. She pointed toward the stage, where a man in uniform stood, scanning the crowd. You should get back to him, Elias said gently. Don't want him worrying. She nodded, then darted off, her flag flapping. Elias watched her go, a warmth spreading in his chest. For a moment he felt seen. But the moment passed, and the crowd's noise swallowed him again. The ceremony continued, speeches blending into one another. Elias's eyes drifted to the stage, where a general in dress blues stepped to the podium. Major General Raymond Holt, the program said, a name Elias didn't know. Holt was younger than Elias expected, maybe 50, his face weathered but sharp, his posture rigid with command. He spoke of duty, of sacrifice, of the debt owed to those who'd served. Elias listened, his fingers tracing the letter's edges. He wondered if Holt had ever been in the thick of it, if he'd ever carried a man through a hail of bullets, if he'd ever felt the weight of a life slipping away. As Holt spoke, a murmur ran through the crowd. A group of young Marines near the front, their uniforms crisp, were whispering, their laughter sharp and careless. Elias's jaw tightened. They were joking about something, maybe the general's speech, maybe the old man on the bench they hadn't even noticed. It wasn't malice, just youth, but it cut all the same. Elias had seen that look before, in hospitals, in bars, in the eyes of people who thought his war was ancient history, irrelevant. He shifted, his hand closing around the letter, and looked away. Then came the moment that changed everything. Holt paused mid-sentence, his eyes scanning the crowd. They landed on Elias, and for a heartbeat, the general's face shifted. Something like recognition, though Elias was sure they'd never met. Holt stepped away from the podium, his boots clicking on the stage, and raised a hand to quiet the crowd. The young Marines fell silent, their laughter dying. Elias felt a prickle at the back of his neck, the weight of eyes turning toward him. Folks, Holt said, his voice carrying across the field, we're here to honor those who've served, but sometimes we miss the ones right in front of us. He gestured toward Elias, who froze, his heart thudding. Sir, would you join me up here? The crowd turned, a ripple of confusion spreading. Elias didn't move, his hands gripping the bench. He wasn't one for stages, for speeches. He'd come to listen, to remember, not to be seen. But Holt's eyes held his, steady and unwavering, and there was something in them. Respect, maybe, or understanding. Elias stood, his knees protesting, and made his way to the stage, the letter still clutched in his hand. The crowd parted, their murmurs growing. A few of the young Marines smirked, their eyes flicking over Elias's worn jacket, his scuffed boots. One whispered something to another, and a laugh broke out, sharp and careless. Elias kept his head high, his steps measured, but the sound hit him like a slap. He'd faced worse, mortars, ambushes, the screams of the wounded. But this was different. It was the laughter of those he'd fought for. Those who didn't know didn't care. He reached the stage, and Holt extended a hand, his grip firm. What's your name, Marine? Holt asked, his voice low, meant only for Elias. Elias Carter, sir, Elias said, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest. Corpsman, 1st Marine Division, 67 to 72. Holt nodded, his eyes searching Elias's face. Vietnam? Yes, sir. The general turned back to the crowd, his hand still on Elias's shoulder. This man, he said, his voice rising, is why we're here. Not just for the names on plaques, but for the ones who walk among us, carrying their service in silence. The crowd stilled, the young Marine's smirks fading. Holt's voice softened, but it carried a weight that silenced the field. Doc Carter, I'd wager, has stories most of us can't imagine, and I'd wager he's never asked for a thing in return. Elias felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected this, hadn't wanted it. But Holt's hand on his shoulder was steady, grounding, and the crowd's eyes were on him now. Not with pity or dismissal, but with something new, curiosity, respect. Holt gestured to the letter in Elias's hand. What's that you're holding, Doc? Elias hesitated, then unfolded the paper, its creases worn thin. "A letter," he said quietly. "From a boy I helped. Long time ago." Holt nodded, his eyes flicking to the crowd. "Care to share it?" Elias's first instinct was to say no. The letter was private. A piece of him he'd kept locked away. But Holt's gaze was steady, and the crowd was waiting, and something in Elias shifted. He cleared his throat, his voice low but clear. "It's from a Marine named Tommy. He wrote it after Hugh, 68. Said I gave him a second chance." The crowd was silent now, the flags snapping in the breeze, the only sound. Elias's voice grew stronger, the words coming easier. "I was a corpsman. Did what I could. Patched up boys. Got him to medevac. Tommy was one of them. Took a bullet, but he made it home. Wrote me this to say thanks." Holt's hand tightened on Elias's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement. "How many others, Doc?" he asked. "How many did you save?" Elias's jaw worked, the number heavy on his tongue. 132, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "That I know of." A murmur ran through the crowd, soft but electric. The young Marines who'd laughed now stood straighter, their faces pale. Holt turned to them, his voice sharp. "You hear that? 132 lives. That's what this man did for us, for you, for this country." And he was told he wasn't on the list. The words hung in the air, a rebuke and a call to attention. Elias felt the weight of the moment, the eyes on him, the sudden shift in the crowd's mood. He didn't want their pity, didn't need their applause. But as Holt stepped back and snapped a crisp salute, Elias felt something he hadn't in years. Pride, not for himself, but for what he'd done, for the lives he'd touched. The crowd began to clap, a slow swell that grew into a roar. Elias stood there, the letter trembling in his hand, his eyes fixed on the flags. He thought of Tommy, of the others, of the nights he'd woken sweating, their faces in his dreams. He thought of the boy who died in his arms, the one he couldn't save, the one whose name he still carried. And for the first time in a long time, he felt seen. Holt leaned in, his voice low. "Stay for the rest, Doc. You're with me now." Elias nodded, his throat too tight for words. He followed Holt to a seat on the stage, the crowd still clapping, the young Marines now standing at attention. The ceremony continued, but it felt different now, charged with a new energy. Elias sat, the letter in his lap, and listened as Holt spoke of legacy, of memory, of the debt owed to those who'd served in silence. The story wasn't over. There was more to Elias's past, to the letter, to the lives he'd saved. There was a truth waiting to be uncovered, a moment that would bind this day to the history he carried. But for now, Elias sat, his head high, his heart steady, and let the crowd's respect wash over him like a tide. Grateful Stories celebrates the quiet heroes among us, those whose sacrifices shape our world in ways we often overlook. Subscribe to hear more tales of compassion, honor, and the power of small acts that change lives. Who have you noticed today? The applause faded, but the weight of the moment lingered. Elias Carter sat on the stage, the letter from Tommy still in his lap, its edges worn soft by years of quiet handling. The Fort Bragg parade field stretched before him, the crowd a blur of faces, soldiers, families, civilians, all watching him now. The flags snapped in the breeze, their colors vivid against the late morning sky. The air smelled of coffee and grass, with a faint metallic tang from the nearby artillery display. Elias's chest felt tight, not with fear, but with something unfamiliar. Recognition. Major General Holt stood beside him, his presence steady, grounding. The ceremony continued, but Elias's mind drifted, tugged back to memories he'd long kept buried. Holt returned to the podium, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "We talk about sacrifice," he said, "but it's men like Doc Carter who give that word meaning. Not just in the heat of battle, but in the years after, carrying the weight of what they've seen, what they've done." He paused, his eyes sweeping the crowd. "We owe them more than a day. We owe them our memory." Elias's fingers traced the letter's creases. He thought of Hugh, 1968, the city a maze of smoke and rubble. He'd been 21, a skinny kid from Fayetteville, with a medic's bag and a stubborn streak. The air had reeked of cordite and blood, the ground slick with mud. He'd moved from man to man, his hands steady despite the chaos, stitching wounds, tying tourniquets, whispering assurances he didn't always believe. Stay with me, you're gonna make it. Tommy had been one of them, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. Elias had dragged him behind a shattered wall, bullets kicking up dirt around them, and worked until the medevac chopper's roar drowned out the gunfire. Tommy had lived. Others hadn't. The general's voice pulled Elias back. Doc Carter, Holt said, turning to him. You said 132 lives. That's a number most of us can't fathom. But I'm guessing there's more to your story. Will you share it? Elias stiffened. He wasn't one for speeches, never had been. His service had been private, his memories locked away in the letter, in the dog tags he still wore, in the nightmares that woke him at 3 a.m. But the crowd was waiting, their faces open, expectant. The young Marines who'd laughed earlier stood silent now, their eyes fixed on him. Lila, the little girl with the flag, sat in the front row, her father's arm around her, watching with wide eyes. Elias cleared his throat, his voice rough but steady. I ain't much for talking, he began, his Carolina drawl soft but clear. Was a corpsman, Vietnam. Did my job, that's all. Patched up boys, got 'em out. Some made it, some didn't. He held up the letter, its yellowed paper catching the light. This here's from Tommy, one I saved. He wrote me after, said I gave him a second chance. I kept it, not for pride, but to remember why I did it. To remember them. The crowd was still, the only sound the flag's rhythmic snap. Elias's eyes drifted to the horizon, where the sun climbed higher, warming the air. 132, he said, his voice quieter now. That's how many I know I got to safety. But there were others I couldn't help. Boys I held while they... He stopped, his jaw tight, then forced himself to continue. You don't forget that. You carry it. Holt nodded, his hand resting lightly on Elias's shoulder. You carried more than most, Doc. And you're still here, honoring them. Elias's gaze dropped to the letter. He hadn't planned to say more, but something in Holt's tone, in the crowd's silence, loosened a knot inside him. There was one, he said, almost to himself. A boy in 69, Charlie Company near Da Nang. Took shrapnel to the chest. I worked on him till my hands gave out. But he was gone. His voice cracked just for a moment. His name was Michael Reed. I never forgot him. The name hung in the air, a quiet offering. Elias hadn't spoken it aloud in years, but saying it now felt like setting down a weight. The crowd didn't move, didn't whisper. Even the young Marines stood frozen, their earlier laughter a distant memory. Holt stepped forward, his voice low but commanding. Michael Reed, he repeated as if sealing the name into the moment. And how many others, Doc? How many names do you carry? Elias didn't answer right away. He looked out at the crowd, at the sea of faces, and saw something new. Understanding, maybe even gratitude. Too many, he said finally. But I ain't here for pity, just to remember. The general turned to the crowd, his eyes fierce. This is why we're here. Not just for ceremonies, but for men like Doc Carter, who gave everything and asked for nothing. We don't just owe him a seat at this event. We owe him our respect every day. The crowd erupted, the applause louder than before, a wave that rolled across the field. Elias sat, his hands steady now, the letter folded back into his pocket. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened, a quiet peace settling over him. Holt leaned in, his voice barely audible over the clapping. There's someone here who wants to meet you, Doc. After the ceremony. Elias nodded, unsure what to expect. The event continued. More speeches, a wreath laying, the sharp notes of taps echoing across the field. But Elias's mind was elsewhere, caught between the past and the present. He thought of Michael Reed, of Tommy, of the others whose faces he still saw in his dreams. He thought of the soldier at the gate, the one who'd turned him away, and the general who'd called him forward. The contrast felt like a lifetime. When the ceremony ended, the crowd began to disperse, families heading to the refreshment tents, soldiers shaking hands. Holt guided Elias to a quieter corner of the field, near a row of old oak trees, their leaves rustling in the breeze. A man waited there, older than Holt, but younger than Elias. His face lined but strong, his eyes bright with something like anticipation. He wore a civilian jacket, but his posture screamed Marine. Doc Carter, Holt said, "This is Daniel Reed." Elias froze, the name hitting like a punch. "Reed?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man nodded, stepping forward. "Michael was my brother," he said, his voice thick. "I was 10 when he died. He wrote home about you, you know. Said you were the best corpsman he'd ever seen. Said you never gave up." Elias's throat closed. He hadn't known Michael had a brother, hadn't known he'd written home. "I'm sorry," he said, the words rough. "I tried to save him." Daniel shook his head, his eyes wet but steady. "You did more than most, Doc. You gave him a chance, and you gave us his story." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, faded photograph. It showed a young Marine grinning, his helmet tipped back. Michael Reed. "This was him," Daniel said, handing it to Elias. "I want you to have it." Elias took the photo, his hands trembling now. Michael's face stared back, young and alive, the way Elias remembered him before the shrapnel, before the blood. "I don't deserve this," Elias said, his voice breaking. "You do," Daniel said firmly. "You carried him all these years. Let me carry some of that for you." Holt watched, silent, as the two men stood together, the weight of decades between them. Then he spoke, his voice gentle but clear. "Doc, we're starting a new tradition here at Bragg. A wall in the Veterans Center for stories like yours. Names, letters, photos, things that remind us who we're honoring. I'd like yours to be the first." Elias looked up, his eyes meeting Holt's. "I ain't special," he said. "Just did my job." And that's why Old Glory snapped in the breeze, a symbol of freedom, but also a reminder of the cost. For Elias Carter, it was a reminder of the men he'd saved, and the one he couldn't. The crowd at Fort Bragg had seen him, had honored him, and in that moment, he'd found something he hadn't known he'd lost: a place to belong. The wall in the Veterans Center would bear his name, Tommy's letter, and Michael's photo, a testament to the quiet heroism that had shaped so many lives. I am very pleased when you subscribe, and our community grows. Nowadays, it is very important to respect the veterans who gave their lives for us. So, do not forget our veterans, and let's expand our community together.